right, welcome to Friday. I hope you guys have had a good week. Today we are going to talk about the Marshall Plan. We're going to look at Europe's recovery and the development of the two sides in Europe. Ultimately you end up with NATO and the Warsaw Pact, which are the two sides, but you end up with these two giant blocks, the American bloc and the Soviet bloc. And a lot of it has to do with the development of the Marshall Plan. So today's question that we're trying to answer is, was the Marshall Plan altruistic? And we're going to take a look at a series of videos. Again, we're going to look at some segments from the CNN series, The Cold War, to understand whether or not, or to help you guys understand whether or not you think it was altruistic. Again, you can argue either side of it. The videos, I hope, will present both sides of the argument for you and give you enough information. Hopefully you have read the textbook material that is due for today. In addition to that, I really hope you read the excerpts from Marshall's speech announcing the Marshall Plan, Wyszynski's speech, which is the response to the Marshall Plan, and also if you've read NSC 68. NSC 68 is perhaps one of the most important documents ever produced at this time frame by the United States. It reorganizes the government, and perhaps one of the most important things it does is it creates the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And it's during the Marshall Plan that the CIA starts to figure out what it can and cannot do in terms of becoming involved in clandestine operations overseas. It's going to be as a result of some of the successes it has during the Marshall Plan that it becomes emboldened and begins to do even more as we get in through the 1950s and into the 60s and 70s and even 80s in relation to the Cold War. All right, so the first thing is we're going to take a short clip to look at Europe and the different ideas between both sides. I want you to see the devastation, what the United States is coming up with, and what the Soviets are thinking. Okay, so let's take a look.
After 5.5 years of a war to defeat fascism, Europe was bankrupt. Industry lay in ruins. Homes were in rubble. People struggled to survive. The Communist Party, which had fought fascism, attracted new recruits.
The appeal of communism to young people and to students was that of a hope that it was possible to create a classless society. Many people believed that communism was going to create a better world, better than the one that existed before the war. This was the only party that you could join if you wanted to change the world.
The man called on by Truman to face the communist threat was the newly appointed Secretary of State, General Marshall, the wartime military leader. He would plan the United States response.
Marshall was an extraordinary man. I've never known anyone like him. He, in many respects, was a very austere, unapproachable man. He never allowed anyone to call him George Marshall, including the president. When the president asked him if he should, he said no, General Marshall will do. He exuded leadership and character.
In March, Marshall met Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov at a meeting in Moscow. Britain and France were there too. The Big Four tried to agree on the future of Germany. Despite warm Russian hospitality, weeks of meetings got nowhere.
Marshall made one last effort. He had an interview with Stalin in the Kremlin, and that interview convinced Marshall that what the Soviets were doing were stalling for time in order for the situation in Western and Central Europe to become more and more adverse so that popular unrest would become greater and greater, the communists would grow in strength, and that maybe communist regimes would come to power in Western Europe without the Red Army having to invade.
At the heart of Europe's problems lay the question of a defeated Germany. Stalin wanted to keep Germany on its knees, concerned that otherwise it would rise up one day and threaten the Soviet Union again. The Americans believed that Germany must get back on its feet before there could be a full European recovery.
Okay, so here you can see the two different sides beginning to develop. When you look at Stalin's approach, you really need to give some thought to the process. The Russians had been invaded by Germany twice in a generation, in a very short period of time. And Stalin may have had some serious concerns about whether Germany should be given its opportunity to become powerful again, and whether it should be allowed to rebuild so that maybe in another 20 or 30 years it would invade the Soviet Union again. You almost have to wonder, is Stalin being true in this fear, or were the Soviets just trying to do as Marshall thought, stall until they could get enough people thinking communism was the way to go and they could take over Western Europe that way? Again, questions that you guys could be thinking about or discussing. So take a moment, discuss it amongst yourselves. Don't spend too much time, but just think about it for a moment. In your groups, talk about it for a couple of minutes, 2-3 minutes tops, and then come back and we will continue with the second part. Okay, welcome back. What we're going to do now is take a quick look. It's about a 3-minute clip on the Soviet side and the Soviet perspective of the Marshall Plan. I'd like you to listen to the Soviet side, understand what they're thinking about, and then ask yourselves, were they right? Was Molotov right? Was Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov correct in his ideas and thinking? Or was it more of a continuation of two different ideologies just trying to keep each other apart?
The Soviet economy also desperately needed investment to make up for the ravages of 4 years of war on Russian soil. In theory, the Marshall Plan was open to both East and West, but would Stalin participate?
Stalin
was always suspicious, and he wasn't keen on it from the very start. He said, "Just you watch it. The situation is quite different from the wartime Lend-Lease American assistance to us. With the Truman Doctrine in place as well, they don't really want to help us. They just want to tear the people's democracies away from our sphere of influence, to win them over, to infiltrate them, to pull them away from the Soviet Union."
In Paris, a foreign ministers' conference opened to frame the European response to the Marshall Plan. Despite Stalin's caution, Molotov and a large Soviet delegation turned up at the conference table.
Molotov listened to all the reports and proposals, although he felt it was clearly not that straightforward, that the aid would be tied up with certain conditions.
Throughout the Cold War, spies were used by both sides. At this critical point, spies in London were passing their Soviet controllers document after document.
Dozens. I mean, all the diplomatic going in and out from the Foreign Office. We had access to everything.
After 6 days of meetings in Paris, Soviet intelligence gave Stalin new information about the Marshall Plan.
Our intelligence service knew everything. We've read all the documents which were produced by the United States, by the government of the United States, which was sent to almost all all European countries, including the government of the Soviet Union, but and other documents which were not sent to the Soviet Union.
Сведения о том, что, в общем-то, и не хотят американцы.
This information confirmed that America didn't really want us to participate in it.
Вообще. Что
They just made this demonstrative gesture in order not to scare away those already dealing with them.
контакт с ними по этим делам. И, в общем-то,
Stalin abruptly told Molotov to pull out of the negotiations.
резко затормозил.
As Molotov left the Paris meeting, he accused the West of dividing Europe into two hostile camps.
There never was any thought that the Soviets would actually join the Marshall Plan, but it was a desirable step to persuade the world that we really were being altruistic here. This was not basically an anti-communist, anti-Soviet measure, and should, by some miracle, the Soviets themselves join, or some of their satellite countries, we would have welcomed them in it. But we didn't think that was a realistic possibility.
Okay, was Molotov right? Take a moment in your small groups, talk about it, and then come right back. And there's a last segment I'd like you to see before you go on to part two. Okay, welcome back. Now we're going to look at the European nations that begin to sign up for the Marshall Plan. At this point, it hasn't been approved by Congress, but nations are signing up. But what's important here is I want you to see the Soviets' response to this, okay? And were both sides still just being the same? Were they trying to develop their own ideologies and pit them against each other? So let's watch the clip.
In September 1947, 16 European nations signed up for the Marshall Plan and requested $20 billion of aid. The Western Alliance began to take shape. The battle lines of the Cold War were being drawn.
The primary purpose was compassionate goodwill, the notion that our former allies needed to have the help of the United States.
План Маршалла Советским Союзом расценивался.
The policy of the Marshall Plan was seen in the Soviet Union as the Americans wanting to impose their influence over the countries to which they gave Marshall aid. The Soviet Union could not accept that, believing it to be an aggressive act on behalf of the Americans. That is why the Marshall Plan was never accepted in our country.
That September 1947, Stalin revived the pre-war Communist International as the Cominform. Through it, Stalin planned to control the countries of the Eastern Bloc. He also instructed communist parties in the West to take the initiative in seizing power. In American propaganda, the Cominform was represented as a sinister, shadowy conspiracy of evil. But its economic associate, Comecon, offered Russian aid to Eastern Bloc countries, sending grain to Czechoslovakia after a bad harvest.
Both
Cominform and Comecon were a direct response to the Marshall Plan. On the one hand, the Cominform would follow the political, ideological line the Soviet Union wanted to adopt in the socialist countries. On the other hand, the aim of Comecon was to provide economic assistance in order to prevent these countries from being torn from our sphere of influence.
February 1948, the Communists reach for power in Czechoslovakia. Workers' militias go on the march. Non-communists are arrested. Action committees take over the police and the labor unions. President Beneš capitulates. The red flag flies in the center of Prague. In just 5 days, the communists took over Czechoslovakia's government. Stalin's rule was imposed on the Czechs.
Okay, so that's the end of part one. Take a moment amongst yourselves to talk about what you said, see if we're still being the same, and then come back and start part two.